The Honorable Minister of Finance.
So I thank the member for the question, and I'm pleased to be able to provide a response and correct the record. So the member has referred a second time to a lost $349 million revenue. Let me see if I can help the member. So first of all, first principles, the government's funding of education continues to go up. The government continues to make record funding to education, K-12, including in COVID-19, above and beyond the print that you see on that page. I think it was page 12 we were referring to, page 14, page 12? Yeah, page 12 under summary expenditure. In addition to that, the member would still have to go to page 28 of the public accounts to see the $92 million in Safe Schools funding, which was held in a separate account and distributed from internal service adjustment to school divisions. And that includes things like you'll see an additional highlight of $7 million in funding dedicated to upgrade ventilation systems in Manitoba schools. Those amounts are all stacked on top of those base fund increases. So it's important to keep in mind for the member that the decision and the action of the government to grant rebate checks to Manitoba households based on that assessment of their property tax and the school tax owing has no implication on school funding. Municipal authorities sent their notice of assessment. Notice of assessment included that notice of education property tax owing, 25% last year and 37.5% this year, was then granted back. And that is in respect of residential properties and for farm families. Farmland is one, government making good investments in education. On the other hand, government continuing to respond to the concerns of Manitoba families on affordability. Now, yesterday, the member seemed to spend an inordinate amount of his time saying that the government was not doing enough for people on affordability. Today, he takes the opposite tact and says, you did too much on affordability. And yet every major bank, every chief economist, the Bank of Canada, the US Fed Reserve, everyone else is saying that the impact on households right now, indeed, the CPI information from Manitoba continues to show, and this member should read that CPI data, and maybe he has, is showing that the year-over-year change, the escalation of the cost of goods, services, fuel, food for your table, clothing for your children, shoes, all of those costs are on the increase. Energy costs in North America, hugely on the increase. And yet I remind that member that Manitoba continues to pay the second lowest energy costs in all of North America. So I would also remind the member, because he seemed to connect the deficit and say that this had a deleterious effect on the results as described in the public accounts, I would remind the member that that $2 billion deficit a year ago was in the middle of a global pandemic when this government was making exceptional investments in people, in programming, in healthcare. And on page 28 and on page 29 of the public accounts, he should review again that list of COVID-19 responses, workforce development agreements, vaccine initiatives, Safe Schools funding, the Restart Capital program, and other, the business payments were substantial. I had a business owner tell me simply, probably 7 days ago, he said, if it were not for the government assistance during COVID-19, I would have shuttered my doors. He has 30 employees. The final point I would make is the government continued to show progress in respect of the public accounts and show progress in the first quarter of the new year, even accommodating these payments at this time to Manitoba households. We will continue to respond to Manitobans who are concerned about affordability.
The member for Fort Garry.
I'll remind the minister that when Brian Pallister came up with this scheme, he had several preconditions. This was going to happen over 10 years, and it was only going to happen after the budget had been balanced. Well, 2 years into this, we're at 37.5% reduction. So certainly more than a 20% reduction. So they're much far ahead on schedule. And the precondition got dropped about doing this when we were in a balanced budget. So we've borrowed money here. And according to the Winnipeg Free Press, March 24, 2022 article, just from last year, Manitobans are going to have to pay for these tax cuts, their words, $1 billion over 7 years with borrowed money just to cover last year's tax cuts. So my question for the minister is, how much more money are we going to have to borrow to pay for the education property tax rebate this year? Is it going to be another $1 billion that you're going to saddle Manitoba's children with?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank you for the opportunity to answer the members' questions. So this is an interesting afternoon because we are receiving a lecture from an NDP member on the importance of being in balance for the public accounts. And so I would say, physician, heal thyself. But to not be facetious, I think we do have to remind ourselves of the performance of the previous government when they were in power. The record of the NDP was, it was consistent, if to say nothing else, but it was consistently bad and underperforming. It's why bond rating agencies, I remember famously in 2014, I think it was Moody's who said, Manitoba budget continues to disappoint. I think at one point in time they said, continues to miss the mark was one of the criticisms that could have been DBRS. There was an almost $1 billion deficit with no global pandemic as a backdrop by the previous NDP government. In the last year, they were in power in the spring, having completely run out of gas and ideas. They returned to the legislature not with a budget, but with what they called a fiscal update, which was a very, very meager document that essentially didn't aim at much. And it continued to show that it was not going to be able to square the circle on budgetary progress. I just want to present to the member page 121 of the budget. It shows the Manitoba summary budget deficit scenarios. And unfortunately, really you can only see on this back, a few years, but there's a helpful chart at the bottom of the page, which does show in a better form, it shows the budget net debt scenario. And it shows how that was, it was increasing significantly under the previous government. I wish that we had charts to show here some of those budgets. I remember $300 million loss, I believe, in about 2012 when I was the critic for finance. 2013 was a very large loss. And this was at a time when the NDP government was actually actively increasing its revenues. How? By jacking up taxes on Manitobans. I remember the widening of the PST. My deputy minister will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the widening of the PST in 2013 or 12 had an implication of about $160 million per year. That was simply the adding in haircuts and personal services. It might have been accounting services at that time, but it might not have been those ones. Legal services, I think, had been done before that. Property insurance, I remember that one. I remember my father telling me about that when we got his property bill, and he waved it in front of me and said, "Who did this to me?" And I said, "I can tell you exactly who did that to you." But the next year, availing themselves of hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money and still not making progress against the deficit was the reason why the bond rating agencies took such a dim view of their progress. So I would want to make it clear to the member a couple of things. This government balanced the budget in 2019 before the pandemic. Many said, some writers in some of our local media said, no government will be able to balance the budget unless they raise the taxes. And instead, what we did is we held the growth of expenditures by reestablishing the primacy of the Treasury Board and good decision-making in order to get the best results. We concentrated on results. We built partnerships. We made progress. We eliminated the deficit. The pandemic took us offline. But that member himself just disclosed that he has seen an amelioration on the bottom line of almost $700 million in respect to the previous year, and now tracking ahead of schedule on this year. So it is our position that we'll continue to make progress on behalf of all Manitobans as we work to eliminate the deficit and make good investments in Manitoba services, unlike the previous government did.
The member for Fort Garry.
I think the minister needs to be reminded of some facts. The previous government had 10 balanced budgets. This government had 1. And when it failed to balance the budget, it had back-to-back floods of the century at a time we had a federal Conservative government that had cut transfers to Manitoba to an all-time low. This government had the opposite advantage. They had a federal government that provided record high transfers that we have never, ever seen before. They inherited an economy that was the second fastest growing in Canada, the first fastest if you removed petroleum-based economies, and they've tanked it now to the 7th fastest growing economy in Manitoba. We now have the second lowest minimum wage in Canada, and for the first time in 20 years, more Manitobans are leaving Manitoba than coming. People are voting with their feet. Stat came out that under this government, there has been a drop in the percentage of home ownership in Manitoba, meaning Manitobans can no longer afford to actually buy a home under this government. And of course, this government has had 2 bond rating agency reductions back-to-back that has never occurred in Manitoba's history, and this government had the 2 highest deficits in Manitoba's history. So this government, I think, has a record objectively of being the most fiscally irresponsible government in modern history. So I know the minister is being obtuse and he understands my question and simply doesn't want to answer it. But the more concerning question is, did you bring in these tax rebates without calculating the cost to the Manitoba Treasury of borrowing money and paying it back and what those interest charges are? And if you did do the responsible thing and make that calculation, why won't you disclose that to the public of how much they're going to have to pay back so that you can give Toronto billionaires a check?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Well, it would seem that we hit a nerve with the critic this afternoon, who's become very, very defensive about his government's record on deficit elimination, and I could understand the reason for that sensitivity. I want to point the members' attention to page 124 of Budget 2022. This is a helpful chart because it shows the annual net income or loss depicted on a fiscal year, but it helpfully goes back to 2013, 2014. I only regret the fact that it does not go back further in these documents, but there's only a certain amount of picture that you can show. The member says you don't understand there was a flood that year. So I wanted to get the clarification from the member. Did he mean in 2013-14? Because in that year, the NDP government indicated a loss of $600 million. So I don't think that was the year of the flood. But it might have been in 2014-15. He said there was a flood. Maybe it was 2014-15 because his government showed a loss of $539 million on a consolidated basis. And in the year when their outgoing year, when Manitobans made a change, they posted a $932 million deficit with no flood. So I think it suffices to say, as bond rating agencies, credit agencies said about the previous government, that they continued to disappoint, they were not making progress, and that they had I believe the term used was that they had a spending problem and not a revenue problem. But to correct the record on something else, I did want to point that member to information that showed federal transfers to the province of Manitoba and indicated the level of transfers and how those had changed over the years. I think we can't find it right now. The member was making a comment about things were way harder then because the federal government's transfers were not as rich. I point the member to page 40 of the public accounts. Page 40 indicates sharp increases to federal transfers under the previous government in 2007-08. Sharp increases in 2008-09, in 9-10, 10-11, 11-12. As a matter of fact, when you see that ratio of federal transfers to total revenue, it gets much more challenging when you look at the years in which our government was actually in power. So I did want to make sure that I addressed that issue as well. On the last issue, the member says, well, what is this going to mean for borrowing requirements? Well, this is exactly why it is important that a government learns to live with its means, because a government that consistently operates from borrowing is a government that is essentially not able to meet the obligations that it should in respect of frontline services. That's why the path to balance matters. And that is why, even though in 2016, when we first described that better approach, a strengthened Treasury Board process, a revamping of the way the estimates process happened, strengthening of the Treasury Board Secretariat's functioning, a strengthening of the comptroller's function, a strengthening of internal audit, a strengthening of the relationship between the Auditor General and the province of Manitoba, a rebasing of the government's books to focus on summary budget and not core budget. I think somewhere in my drawers in my office, I still have a t-shirt that reads, "We are summary," that I think the Treasury Board gave out at the Secretariat. So I could perhaps get the member one of them. There will be no cost involved, I assure him. But the fact of the matter is, on the basis of those investments, we made progress. We eliminated the deficit. So now, if the question that the member is asking is essentially this: who should Manitobans believe when it comes to the ability to stabilize the finances and make investments and reduce the cost of borrowing? I think the answer is clear on the basis of page 124 in these public accounts. It is our progressive conservative government who has eliminated the budget once, or eliminated the deficit once, and will do so again, not on the backs of frontline services, but while making those excellent and historic investments in frontline services. Why? Because Manitobans need and deserve them.
The member for Fort Garry.
So just so the minister may know, I was elected in 2019, so it wasn't my government. And you'd be hard pressed to find anybody in our caucus who was actually around 10 years ago who was in a position of authority back then. So I appreciate that he would rather talk about the very distant past than his shameful record. And he has his government has a lot to be embarrassed about. Because it has been a disappointing result for Manitobans. But I'm going to come back to the question, and we can spend the rest of the day, asking it and you ignoring it. How much money will it cost Manitoba taxpayers in interest and expenses for this latest round of rebate checks that you were borrowing for?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to answer this question on the cost of borrowing and the impact of deficit financing on borrowing and borrowing schedules. I want to refer the member to page 67 of the public accounts, and he can see the consolidated statement of revenue and expense, and there's a line at the very bottom that refers to debt servicing. And he can see there that the actual debt servicing cost for the 2022 year were actually reduced from the budgeted amount. And he will probably see there is an indication in these books that talks about the reason for that variance. So obviously the program cost a little bit less in the year that has completed than was anticipated. I know that in previous years that cost of borrowing was above $1 billion. The cost of the depiction of the accumulated deficit is actually shown just 2 pages previously. So the member can see on page 65, there is those accumulated deficits, and that is essentially depicting those years of deficit spending and deficit financing, many of them under the NDP. The other artifact I would want to enter at this point in today's conversation is from the budget on page 125. And there is a helpful chart that shows the net debt as a percentage of provincial GDP. So a net debt to GDP. And the member was talking about how things were worse under the NDP. Well, the performance was definitely worse because the net debt to GDP increased precipitously until 2016. And what this chart depicts is a very sudden arrest of the significant increase of net debt to GDP that happens concurrent with the PC party that takes government in 2016. And then the member notices there's a stabilization. As a matter of fact, there's a net modest amelioration that is happening in net debt to GDP, which of course is one indicator of the strength of an economy. And so the member sees, of course, in 2021, the pandemic takes us offline, but there he begins to see thereafter, again, stabilization happening, including the very last column, that budget projection of a net debt to GDP, a number that continues to go in the right direction. So between 2016-17 and 2019-20, the net debt slowed to a 3.6% annual growth rate, compared to a 10% annual growth rate in the 4 previous years, 10.9%. That's a very significant change. So suffice it to say, I will take no lessons from this member when he talks about economic and budgetary performance. He's living in the fantasy land. The numbers simply do not support his premise. I find it really interesting that the member this afternoon actually walks away from the record of his government for 16 years. He said, I wasn't in these seats. This was not my government. And he disavowed himself of any kind of responsibility. And yet on his lawn sign, it clearly shows NDP. Unless he's expunged the NDP from his lawn sign, he is running on the fiscal record. And I would say to the member, he can run, but he can't hide from the financial record of his own party. Really interesting to see the critic for finance for the NDP today wash his hands of the financial mismanagement and underperformance that happened for 16 fiscal years. Loss after loss after loss. No wonder Moody's wrote, continues to disappoint. And so he says, it wasn't my government. I happen to know the member for Concordia is still on those benches. The member, I can't say his name in the chamber, is clearly still on these benches. my colleagues could help me out. He has a constituency off of Henderson Highway, and the name of the constituency is Elmwood. He is still on the benches of the NDP party, so I wonder, are all the members running from the record of their party? They may want to, but Manitobans know the truth, and that is that their government failed to make progress.
The member for Fort Garry.
It's deeply disappointing to watch the minister's performance the last couple of days, because it has been a performance. Estimates is an accountability measure. It's part of our democracy. When I, as the critic, ask questions, it's not on my behalf, it's on behalf of the people of Manitoba. I ask the questions that they would ask if they were in my seat in order to hold this government to account. I think it shows the utmost contempt to Manitoba people, where the minister refuses to answer straightforward, reasonable questions that the people of Manitoba deserve an answer, like you have now borrowed, or the minister has borrowed, $350 million in order to provide rebate checks, which are going to have interest and carrying costs that another generation of Manitoba voters will have to pay back at some point, and refusing to give that information out to Manitobans. Refusing to provide that information is absolutely contemptuous of Manitobans, and it really turns the estimates process into a farce. So I'm hoping that the minister will govern himself accordingly. I'm hoping the minister will act in a more reasonable and responsible manner for the remainder of the time that we so pleasantly get to spend together, and will answer this question. So I'll ask again, how much is this going to cost Manitoba taxpayers to pay back the money that was borrowed for this rebate check?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, I will start by saying, Mr. Chair, that I would thank the member to keep a civil tone in these proceedings. We will take no lectures from the member about civility or contempt. I've seen the opposition parties use these processes to thump and cajole and scold and threaten. And I would just thank him to return to a tone of civility. We can have a good and frank conversations. I think that Manitobans take a real interest when the critic for the opposition party sits at this table and disavows any responsibility from 15, 16 years of his party's former performance while he lectures the government on its fiscal performance. How is this not relevant? Manitobans, if they sat in these proceedings, would find that interesting. If we took a 5-minute water break and Manitobans were in this room and we walked out in the hall, we said, "What did you hear?" I think they would say they found that very interesting, because what it implies is that there should be no way that Manitobans can attach the promises now of this opposition party to the record that they formerly had when they were in government, when they held these seats. So I thank the member for his civility going forward. Happy to answer his questions. There's a few clarifications that are important to make. Programs, including the education property tax rebate, are not debt financed. They are not deficit financed. They are financed through own source revenues. I point the member to the public accounts, to the budget and actual performance for revenue. Revenue budgeted at $17.8 billion. Revenues in actual stated as $19.1 billion. We could have good, frank, and long conversations this afternoon about what the reason is for that difference in revenue performance, an increase of $1.2 billion. Personal corporate income tax revenue up. Retail sales tax up. Increasing as the economy recovered from COVID-19 and employment and economic activity increased. We indicated this in Q3. We had indicated it in the forecast, but clearly there was this amelioration taking place. I said publicly, I'm sure that the member heard me say last week, that clearly leading experts underestimated the speed and the velocity and the impact in which the economy recovered coming out of the global pandemic. So the member asks, well, what will that tax rebate cost in terms of borrowing? Tax rebates are not borrowed for. They are paid for from own source revenues. COVID-19 contingencies indicated in this budget at $630 million would be debt financed. The $100 million emergencies fund that appears every year in the government's books would be debt financed. Capital programs would be debt financed. So that amortization schedule is completed. There are public sector accounting rules that drive the determination of the length of time in which completed assets are to be paid back. There's that calculation of principal and interest, and the government has schedules that it must keep, and it must stay within that capital lane, if you will. So just to be really clear, and to make very clear to the member that I'm completely the government has done a lot to create the conditions in which businesses have certainty, even coming out of the global pandemic. They were able to hire workforce. They were able to sell products and deliver goods and manufacture and send to market. And these revenues for companies and businesses and individuals have meant that government also profits. So we continue to build the Manitoba economy. We're proud of the work that we've done. We know that businesses are doing a lot of heavy lifting right now looking for workforce. We're assisting them as we can to be able to make workforce available. But essentially, we are proud to be making investments in affordability at this time for all Manitobans.
The member for Fort Garry.
Again, that's a deeply disappointing response from the minister. He's clearly not taking the estimates process seriously, and he's clearly not going to give a credible answer to the Manitoba people about a very straightforward and open case. The Manitoba government cut $350 million worth of rebate checks that had to come from somewhere. And we know that they didn't have the money in the bank and they had to borrow it. And we know that when you borrow, there's interest and carrying costs. And that is very much something that he can calculate and provide to the Manitoba people. He understands the question. He's refused to answer it now multiple times. And I think that absolutely shows contempt of these proceedings and of this process. And it's deeply unfortunate that the minister wants to conduct himself that way, and he wants Manitobans to remain in the dark about his own government's fiscal choices. So I will move on, and maybe the minister will grace us with an answer on this question. How much money did it cost the government to send out education property tax rebate checks in the mail this year?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
First of all, I would just want to make clear that it's a little disappointing to hear the member persist in this idea that I'm being contemptuous. For those who are watching video proceedings and my colleagues at the table, I think that they can see that I don't look any more, I guess, I don't look contemptuous. I'm attempting to answer the member's question, but I will at this time take the moment to indicate that I have seated in front of me the Deputy Minister of Finance, Secretary to the Treasury Board, the Comptroller for Manitoba, and the Assistant Deputy Minister for Treasury Division. There are not 4 more qualified people in the province of Manitoba on these issues that we are discussing to be able to provide answers. Oh, and I also have the Executive Financial Officer for Finance seated just away from the table, who's been supporting these conversations all afternoon as well. This is in addition to the individuals in my department within the operations of finance and the Secretariat who are staffing both in the room and those who join us from probably the video audio link. So I really hope that the member will measure his words. The advice at this table to that member in respect to the question that he asked is that the programs of government, including the education property tax rebate, are not debt financed. They are not something that we go and tell the Assistant Deputy Minister at their shop and Treasury Division to go borrow to support the cost of. The government has expenditures that are all listed in these public accounts in the budget. The government has revenues that are all listed. There's a helpful schedule that shows exactly the growth of revenue over projections by subcategory, all those areas of taxation. And then on the basis of that, we present those consolidated, the consolidated picture for the government's net income loss. But I would want to add this as well. The members saw that in respect of the year that is completed, that the public account shows, we started with the budgetary target of $1.4 billion approximately, and showed an end of the year result of just over $700 million, an improvement of $700 million in year. But then even then on the first quarter result, showing another $500 million improvement. So even in respect of those parts of the budget that are debt financed, the member should know they're dramatically reducing as a result of that improvement to the government's bottom line. So I wanted to say that for the record and invite the member to stop with the talk about contemptuousness and return to a good and frank conversation where he can perform his role, which is important, and I can perform mine and provide him information. On the cost of the 2021 education property tax rebate check costs, I will give them the numbers for last year's total cost. We would assume that the numbers for this year, while not totally costed, would be very similar because there's been no significant change in the manner or the form that this work is conducted. Finance works to print, so think of the paper costs and the printing costs are within the Department of Finance. The MDA, the Material Distribution Agency, which resides actually in the Department of Labor, Consumer Protection, and Government Services, is responsible for the actual physical stuffing of envelopes, affixing of postage, and the mailing of checks. Those costs are as follows: printing, $49,373; mailing, $442,617; inserts, $15,510, for a total of $507,000. Total number of checks last year, 456,000. Cost per check, $1.11.
The member for Fort Garry.
Again, I'd like to urge the minister to not treat the estimates process as some type of game, and that in my respectful view, part of his role is to provide information to Manitobans in a forthright manner. Now, I think the minister did answer my last question. In 2021, it cost the province $915,000 to mail out checks to Manitobans. The Canadian Taxpayer Federation has criticized this. Director Todd McKay saying, obviously, there's smarter ways to move money these days, cheaper, more efficient ways to do it. The government needs to put some effort into that. That's a CBC article, June 9th, 2022. So my question to the minister is this: did the province consider other ways to send out these checks, and why weren't they chosen?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
I'm happy to correct the record for the member. The answer to his question, though, I'll begin with, is essentially yes. He asked the question, were other methods of distributing amounts to Manitobans considered? And the answer is yes. But I want to provide this context, and it helped guide him to the rationale that we took for the manner and the method in which we distributed these checks. First of all, a clarification, though. He indicated that the cost, after I just read it into the record, he indicated that the cost was $900,000. I think I was clear that the cost was $507,000. $507,000, not $900,000, as was just alleged by the member. The member knows that we have been sending out rebate checks even before the amount is due. So there is an emphasis placed on the quick sending of the check. We want people to understand that their benefit in respect of the rebate is arriving before the total amount is due. And we think that it's important to align those dates, the date in which their property tax is due, and the date in which this rebate would be in the mail. On the basis of that, because of the urgency to send those checks out, we chose to proceed in the manner in which government has sent out checks before, and that is by physical check in the mail. So the member may be asking the question, well, why didn't you just get things reconciled somehow on taxes owing to the government after the completion of the 2022 fiscal year? Well, that wouldn't then allow people to be in possession of a check that would align with the month in which those taxes were owing. So first of all, we would say that's why the reconciliation is happening in this form. But also, I think to the member's broader question, well, why a check? Well, look, when it comes to the federal government's climate and incentive program, those quarterly payments, they're right now going out a combination of checks and electronic formats. Certainly in future, this government is interested to know, as the world continues to change, how we can modernize our practices. I can see in future a time, I think less and less people are using checks. I know that even, for my online banking now, I can deposit checks digitally, things we couldn't do 5 years ago. We had to go to the ATM with our check. So certainly the world is in the middle of a very, very dramatic and accelerating digitization. But the government has also paid attention to this. The government, the member will see in the public accounts and in the budgets, our commitments to efficiency and effectiveness. I'm thinking just for a moment about things like the fact that, under the NDP, even a ministerial binder per week for the cabinet or the Treasury Board, these were all paper documents. There were thousands and thousands of individual pages generated every week on photocopiers and then delivered, kind of run across the lawn of the Manitoba legislature from the offices in which they were printed and delivered to members of those committees. This is now all a fully digitized process. We've gone to a digital format. I believe that many of our boards and agencies and commissions in Manitoba now have similarly translated into a digital board book, way better for the security of documents where you can grant and rescind privileges to read, and way more efficient and way cheaper, way less wasteful of resources. But there's so many other areas I could point to. I mean, the public accounts that used to be published in 4 volumes. I remember as a new member of this legislature, I was elected exactly 11 years ago today, as was the member for Portage la Prairie. It's our anniversary today. But I remember at the time, volume 4 was like 1,000 pages and they would print it. And it was like a big binding system to get that volume printed. It's now all digital. In justice, the court modernization project is currently underway that will replace thousands and thousands of documents with digital and electronic forms of the same. So our proactive disclosure section of the website proactively digitally discloses documents that used to be only able to be retrieved in a standard conventional paper base. So to the member's question, yes, we are interested in ways to do things more efficiently. I can see in future the transition from check form to electronic form, but for the time being, this was the best method in the opinion of the government.
The member for Fort Garry.
4.1% of the checks the province mailed out in 2021 have yet to be cashed as of June of this year. That means 6.8 million of taxpayers' money is still sitting somewhere unclaimed. It's clear that there's obviously better ways to give people money, and this government obviously chose the one method that makes them look best in their attempt to buy Manitoba votes. It's likely that some of these recipients didn't even bother to cash their checks as they were so small. I think it's been reported one condo owner received a check of $8. The $915,000 price tag, that came from a June 9th, 2022 CBC News article. So that's where that number comes from. So I'm going to ask the minister what other methods were considered in this situation. Why were they rejected?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Could the member just repeat the last sentence? We were attempting to get information for his answer, but I just missed the very last sentence.
The member for Fort Garry.
So the minister indicated that there was in fact alternative methods of delivery considered. I'm wondering if he can inform the committee what alternative methods were considered and why those methods were rejected for paper checks.
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you. I'm happy to answer the member's question about alternatives to check as the delivery mechanism for these education property tax rebates. A number of things were considered, but of course the most obvious alternative to sending checks would have been to send payments by direct deposit. It might surprise the member to know that based on the work that was done to determine, the method of payment, that the rejection rate for direct deposit actually exceeds that of sending checks. That rejection rate can be as high as 6%. Why does this happen? People change banking institutions. They close bank accounts. I know that I regularly have to be reminded in working with my own accountant when he sends me a notice and says, is this still the right account? Oh, no, my account's changed. Sorry, we need to update my account. Put my return in this account instead. So, but there's more to it than that, because the member would have to also realize that we do not have in Manitoba Finance a direct deposit system for property taxes. There is no system that exists. So that would have required a registration process, an application process, where every Manitoban would have had to basically register this is my account. Then imagine, there had to be a way to test that because one digit entered incorrectly and you've got the wrong person's account. So there would have to be some kind of maybe like a 3-point validation or a 2-point validation of that account's veracity and ownership. And then there would have to be controls put in place. That would have taken time. This is why I tell the member, I think in future, this is definitely the way we will go. I think that if I talk to my colleagues in other jurisdictions, we will probably all be at a slightly different point on that continuum of making that transition to cashless or checkless. But I would also make this point, and this is not a comment on ageism, because I kind of like my checkbook still, but I know that speaking to people like my father and people his age, I was with a person a week ago, and we went to make a payment at a farmer's market. And this individual, I said, I have no cash with me. They said, well, I've got a check. I'm going to pay by check. And I said, this farmer's market takes checks? Absolutely, they take checks. And here were vendors taking checks from Manitobans. So I think it would be a little too soon to indicate that the check is dead. So the finance minister will make no such pronouncements these afternoons at these proceedings. Instead, as I said last time, I really believe that at this point in time, based on the timelines and the desire to deliver a rebate check to Manitobans that would come concurrently with the bill that they would owe for their education property tax, based on the fact that there is no system that exists within finance or the government to essentially send a direct payment to an individual, that we chose to do it this way. The last thing I want to say to the member is, so what does happen when a check isn't cashed? Well, first of all, I would suggest to the member it's too soon to count out Manitobans who might not have cashed that check. We continue to have evidence that people are still cashing last year's checks. That continues to take place. So even now, that cashing of checks will continue. But if any Manitoban feels that they didn't cash their check, what should I do? Remember, that check does not stale date. You can take that check into a financial institution, take it to the ATM, put it in the slot, it will be cashed, that check will be good. And even if it's lost, all an individual needs to do is phone finance. They can have an easy process to register their identity. They can say, look, I live at such and such an address. I lost my education property tax rebate. I know I was eligible for it. It didn't come, and finance can send a new check. So we will fully expect that the 4.1% uncashed check rate to which the member refers will continue to draw down as time goes on. I think I had one last comment I was going to make to the member. Oh, yes. He talked about, he thought the cost of sending the checks was $900,000. That was an estimate. It was a budgeted amount. We've produced the actuals, and that actual shows that number of $507,000 as a total cost.
The member for Fort Garry.
A CBC analysis of Winnipeg Properties found that the top 10% of education tax rebate recipients received 4 times more money than the bottom 10%. That was a May 19, 2022 CBC article. Does the minister think that this tax rebate benefited everyone equally?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
So I thank the member for the question, and so we'll just remind him of a few principles in the way properties are assessed in Manitoba. On a 3-year basis, municipalities undertake to refresh their analysis of property valuations, property values. And on the basis of those property values, and you get those notices of assessment and notice of assessment changes, and sometimes that is up and sometimes that is down. And then if individuals feel, and this is for any category of assessed property, it could be residential, it could be commercial or otherwise, there are processes by which there can be appeals made. But essentially that then on the basis of those, there's a determination made not just of municipal tax owing for that value or assessed value of property, but also of the education property tax owing. So when the member asks questions about fairness, yes, the 25% in respect of the previous year and the 37.5% rebate of education property tax is consistent right across, no matter what that bill indicated was the tax owing. For every single residential property that received that rebate, it was a 37.5% calculation returning that education property tax paid to the individual or individuals. 456,000 rebates made, almost $500,000 rebates in categories of residential, farmland, commercial, railway, telecom, and maybe one or two other categories that I might be forgetting. Institutional, yep. And the rebate, of course, 37.5 for farmland and residential, and the rebate of 10% for the other categories. The average check, $588, I believe, in this year. I'm checking that number now. There we go, $581, page 171 under EPTC in his documents. Very good. And so on the last question to the member's question about, I guess, equity. So the member will say, well, a person with a larger house, I shouldn't say larger, a person with a home assessed with a higher value got a higher check back than a person with a lower assessed value of home. Yes, but the member fails to also then disclose that the person with the higher value of home paid that much more to support public education in Manitoba. So the proportionality exists and it continues. One individual may pay $4,000 a year to support public education in Manitoba, regardless of whether they have school-aged children and regardless of whether those school-aged children attend public school or not, they are still paying. That is the basis of our social compact. We pay for the provision of services for all of us. Even if we do not seek health care, we pay to have a strong and vital health care system. Even if we don't have school-aged children, we pay to support a strong and vital K-12 education system. Even if we are not sending children to university or attending there ourselves, we are paying for a post-secondary institutional system. So the member might say, well, one person got a larger check back, yes, and that individual paid a larger amount. And the proportion on which the rebate was paid back to them was exactly the same, 37.5%. At the end of the day, these are times in which Manitobans are focused more than ever on affordability. They know the cost increasing for groceries, for gasoline, their mortgages on renewal, their car payments as those schedules change, any lines of credit that are floating, that are subject to higher costs. Manitobans know right now the importance of being able to meet those household obligations. And indeed, fewer Manitobans feel confident right now about meeting those end-of-month obligations. And that is why our government is taking historic measures to help Manitobans now, including our education property tax rebate.
The member for Fort Garry.
Wondering if the minister knows who Emmanuel Saputo is, Charles Koch, David Taylor, or Peter Thompson. They all received checks from this government. And in case you don't, Emmanuel Saputo is the 8th richest person in Canada, estimated net worth of $5.2 billion US. This government gave him a $12,813 education property tax rebate. Charles Koch is the 15th richest person in the world with an estimated net worth of $70 billion US. He's a massive donor to the US Republican Party and funds groups that lobby against environmental regulation. This government sent him a $80,414 check. The Thompson family are the 26th richest in the world with an estimated net worth of $49.2 billion. And they're the 3rd, 4th, and 5th richest people in Canada as individuals. The Thompson family received a whopping $259,709 from this government. Does the minister believe that these people, some of the richest in the world, need a tax rebate? And would you like to revisit the notion that this rebate is benefiting people equally?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
So we understand what the member is playing at, and he's busy trying to play to his base, and he's playing the game of class warfare. He's trying to say that there are some people who should get benefits and some people who should not. But let's make a couple of things clear. He's conflating the names of people who have been enormously successful in their personal lives and in their professional lives with people who live in Manitoba. So if he's aware that the CEO for Koch International, K-O-C-H that is, resides in Manitoba, I certainly have no evidence to that end. I believe that the Koch family still resides in the Midwest. I think that the global headquarters for Koch International is actually in Kansas City or maybe Wichita. So let's be very clear. There are no residential education property tax payments made for the personal residences of any of the individuals that the member just noted. I believe without question, these might be American citizens. However, those companies are doing business all over the world. And those companies, of course, are doing business here in Manitoba. And even in this committee room this afternoon, we have members of our government who have had a chance to meet with executives and the local leadership team at Koch Fertilizer in Brandon, Manitoba. And so I'm citing for the member this afternoon, Koch Fertilizer in Brandon employs 265 full-time employees. Koch Fertilizer in Brandon recently completed a new Canadian global headquarters on the Brandon property. I had the opportunity to tour it with the Premier and other members of the government probably less than 6 months ago. It is phenomenal to see the number of employees who make their home there. Now, the member could think about the amount of corporate income tax that Koch Fertilizer pays, not in New York, not in Nebraska, but in Manitoba, or the amount of personal income tax that employees who work for Koch Fertilizer, I could imagine, I could run some quick numbers based on a notional amount of salary to determine what the total payroll would be. But then also include the fact that this company pays the post-secondary education tax, which is that payroll tax in Manitoba. And even though we're making progress on that tax, those are very, very significant obligations. But don't forget about the fact that the retail sales tax is paid and the fuel tax is paid. And you're talking about a company that has 400 to 600 trucks on the road every year delivering product and 300 to 400 rail cars. So the contribution to Manitoba causes me to cite again for the member to go back to the budgeted and actual revenues for the province of Manitoba. For the year 2022, ending 2022, those revenues were estimated first at $17.8 billion, but actually came in at $19.1 billion. It is in part the Saputos and the Koch Fertilizers and the many other companies who do business on that member would declare war on, who are helping to contribute to a robust economy. No wonder the Bank of Canada recently said that Manitoba as an economy is one of the leaders in Canada right now based on a number of different metrics. They were citing strength in the Manitoba economy, a favorable net debt to GDP ratio that is moving in the right direction, attention given by the government, making good investments in frontline services.
Order. The hour being 5 p.m., committee rise.